is porting over to marketplace.org. Skin in the game, what video games can teach us about business, economics, culture, the marketplace things. I'm David Brancaccio with our morning report. From APM, American Public Media.
After a roller coaster summer, the ballots are set, and the countdown to November has begun. Stay with NPR News to get closer to the issues and closer to your vote.
The Jacksonville Women's Network presents its 25th annual Speakers Forum, Imaginable, featuring 3 dynamic women, Taylor Denise Richardson, Kimberly Bellflower, and Dr. Roxana Dronka. Wednesday, October 9th at Deerwood Castle. Info at jackswomensnetwork.com.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, with another major hurricane forecast to impact our region, we get the latest on Milton's path and strength from Florida Public Radio Emergency Network Chief Meteorologist Megan Borowski. Then, the Supreme Court was once called the least dangerous branch of government. As SCOTUS begins its new term, we ask JU Law School Dean Nick Allard whether that's changing. Plus, passing a passion for classical music to the next generation. We talked to Symphony Director Courtney Lewis about mentoring young musicians through their Artist-in-Residence program. Join the conversation. You can reach us on air at 904-549-2937. You can also email questions or comments.
Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Hurricane Milton is a dangerous Category 4 storm with top sustained winds of 145 miles per hour. It's aiming for Florida's Gulf Coast and may get there by late tomorrow night. Dozens of counties are under evacuation orders. The mayor of Tampa warns if people stay behind, quote, you're going to die. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis says evacuation shelters are open and there's a way to get there.
Florida's also partnered with Uber for Hurricane Milton evacuation, so you can get free rides to and from shelters in counties with active evacuation orders. They did this with Hurricane Helene. They're now doing it with Hurricane Milton.
The storm surge could be as much as 12 feet in some coastal areas. Florida officials say that is not survivable. Later today, Vice President Harris is scheduled to appear on ABC's talk show The View. NPR's Deepa Shivaram reports the Democratic presidential nominee is expected to roll out a new plan to expand Medicare coverage to include at-home care for seniors.
Americans who are caring for their kids while also caring for aging parents are known as the sandwich generation. And according to the Harris campaign, those adults make up a large percentage of voters who are still undecided. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans falls into the demographic. In its current form, Medicare doesn't widely cover assistance like home health aides for seniors, which can be costly, and nursing home facilities are also expensive. Harris's plan to expand Medicare would be paid for in part by expanding Medicare drug price negotiations, her campaign says. Deepa Shivaram, NPR News.
Harris will also appear on The Howard Stern Show and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert tonight. Republican vice presidential candidate Ohio Senator J.D. Vance will campaign in Detroit this afternoon. He's expected to discuss the auto industry. His running mate, former President Donald Trump, is expected to visit Detroit on Thursday. Abortion is illegal in Georgia again after approximately 6 weeks of pregnancy. The Georgia Supreme Court reinstated the abortion ban just a week after a lower court blocked it. From member station WABE, Jess Mador reports.
The Georgia Supreme Court ruling halts a recent decision by a lower court striking down the 6-week abortion ban. 6 weeks is before many people realize they're pregnant, and a Fulton County judge had ruled the abortion law violates state constitutional privacy rights. The state is appealing that decision. The Georgia High Court ruling allows the ban to remain in effect as it considers the case. Georgia's abortion restrictions took effect in 2022 after the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Roe v. Wade overturning national abortion protections. For NPR News, I'm Jess Mador in Atlanta.
This is NPR.
It's now 4 minutes after 9 o'clock. This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. I'm Michelle Corum. The First Coast could see an influx of evacuees from Hurricane Milton over the next few days. Mandatory evacuation orders have been given for several counties across the Tampa Bay area. The state's encouraging most people to evacuate inland. But Florida Division of Emergency Management Director Kevin Guthrie is encouraging people who are power dependent to evacuate to areas north of the state, like Jacksonville.
If you are 100% going to need to be dependent on power and you have the means to do so, you may want to consider a Jacksonville. It's likely that Jacksonville will not experience any type of power outage.
Currently, no evacuation orders have been given for the northeast Florida area. The current local impacts include 4 to 8 inches of rainfall, possible flooding, and tropical storm force winds. Putnam County schools are closed today through Thursday. County officials are urging some people in low-lying areas to evacuate ahead of Hurricane Milton, which has the potential to bring flooding. Some of the evacuations in areas include along Dunn's Creek, a large section of Palatka's north side, and sections of the St. Johns River. We are under a storm surge warning for our area, a high surf advisory for today. It's now 70 degrees. We'll be in the low 80s this afternoon. Showers and thunderstorms between noon and 5 today.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people, and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, helping NPR advance journalistic excellence in the digital age.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in October, we look at the Supreme Court docket at a time of heightened visibility and controversy. Later in the program, how the Jacksonville Symphony is working to broaden the appeal of classical music. But first, Hurricane Milton is now a Category 4 and its path is becoming more certain. To give us an update on where, when, and how intensely the storm will impact Florida and the First Coast, I'm joined by Megan Borowski, Interim Director and Chief Meteorologist for the Florida Public Radio Emergency Network. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well. Thanks for watching this storm for us. Megan, catch us up if you can, where we are right now.
So we still are watching Milton. It's over the waters of the southern Gulf of Mexico right now. The storm explosively intensified yesterday into a very strong Category 5 storm. We've had a little bit of weakening over the past 18 hours or so. We're now a strong Category 4, winds up to 145 miles an hour. This storm is going to start to accelerate, though, and we're looking at landfall tomorrow night or very, very, very early on Thursday morning near the Tampa Bay area. And the biggest threats that we're looking for there are flash flooding, but really on top of that, the storm surge of 10 to 15 feet in the Tampa Bay area.
Obviously very concerning for the west coast of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people here in this region and in South Georgia are also watching to see impacts. Are we expecting it to be a hurricane strength storm by the time it passes over the First Coast area?
Potentially, as it's moving across the state of Florida, it's really going to parallel I-4, so impacting Orlando, Melbourne, and the Jacksonville area. It should stay at hurricane strength as it crosses into the Atlantic Ocean just off the Space Coast by early Thursday afternoon. And so in Jacksonville, you can expect a gradient of heavy rainfall for the south side of town and farther south along the First Coast, closer to New Smyrna Beach and Daytona. That's where the heaviest of rain is possible, locally up to a foot of rain possible there. But in the immediate vicinity of Duval, anywhere from 4 to 6 inches. Farther north, maybe 2 to 4 inches of rainfall. But also, we're looking at rough surf, rip currents, and storm surge 2 to 4 feet in the St. Johns River itself, and 3 to 5 feet directly along the ocean.
And so we know places like St. Augustine get a lot of flooding traditionally, even in a heavy rainstorm. What is going to happen to the storm once it kind of gets back out over the water in the area of, maybe St. Johns County or Melbourne?
Well, so we are expecting it to continue to move to the east, so it will be pulling away from the coastline. But really, tomorrow afternoon into the overnight, the First Coast and the Space Coast will have onshore winds. and that's when we're looking at that heightened threat for the storm surge flooding, and also, hurricane force winds or wind gusts at least along the counties along the direct Atlantic. So a hurricane watch is in effect for those counties now.
And we know that there's obviously a lot of people evacuating from the Tampa area. Would you
Yeah.
anticipate any evacuation orders in this area? And give us a time zone of when people should really focus on staying off the roads.
Yeah, I'm not sure the official threshold from local EMs in the vicinity of Duval, St. Johns County, Flagler counties, but I would say to take the threat of 3 to 5 feet of storm surge seriously. It's not something that you want to try to fight or battle, but just follow the directions from local EMs because they know when we really need to evacuate in the immediate area. But regarding impacts, you can expect showers to start arriving from southwest to northeast to later tomorrow, and we could have tropical storm force wind gusts arrive as early as tomorrow, maybe during the evening commute, but it's more likely overnight into Thursday morning that we'll start to see those winds arrive from Milton.
Well, Megan Borowski, we will be touching base with you over the next couple of days in the morning to update us. But thank you so much for talking to us this morning, and please stay safe.
Absolutely. You too.
Up next, the Supreme Court was once called the least dangerous branch. We asked the dean of JU's law school whether that's changing. Welcome back. The first Monday in October is the traditional start to the Supreme Court term. We take a look at the SCOTUS docket at a time of heightened visibility and controversy. I'm joined now by Nick Allard, the founding dean of the Jacksonville University College of Law. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning. Thank you, Ann, and your listeners for making time amidst all the preparations for Milton.
Yeah.
I mean, it's humbling to try to say something that's worth a distraction and diversion from our unwanted visitor.
Yes, although very many important cases going before the court, and it's a really important time for the court. I mean, really, in our memory, the court has never been this controversial and possibly this political.
No, it isn't. The polls show that. The public acceptance and approval of the court is at an all-time low. For example, there's an Annenberg study in 2005, as recently as that. The court was at 75% approval, which is astonishing, and it's now down below well below 50%.
Wow. So this is due, I think, in some part to concerns about this court's putting aside a legal doctrine that basically instructs courts to follow the rules and the principles and the standards of previous court decisions. That's something called stare
decisis.
Stand
by the decision or precedent. And, lawyers like precedents for a lot of reasons, good reasons. When people count on a rule, they may be surprised and disadvantaged if the rule changes dramatically. And also, it's nice to have predictable and stable decisions. But on the other hand, America's constitutional democracy is an unfinished symphony. So it may always be so and never finished. But the Supreme Court has always played a critical role in helping us decide how to apply our existing Constitution and laws to our ever-changing world. And so by definition, they take things where the application of the rule, they take cases and controversies, where the application of the rule of law is not certain. But on the other hand, they have a long-standing tradition of relying on precedent. And for the last 3 years, the court has in effect been a series of hurricanes in upsetting long-standing precedents in the area of reproductive rights, in racial application in college admissions, and in this stunning recent July case about presidential immunity.
And it's not that the court never reverses itself, right? I mean, we know that desegregation was a landmark decision that followed previous court decisions supporting segregated education, for instance, and segregated public places. And so they do occasionally go against their precedent and revise their previous opinions.
That is true, and decisions and rulings should be changed when in our very extremely the most diverse country in the world, a consensus grows that things are wrong and need to be changed. So, for example, the racial bias cases of Dred Scott or Plessy versus Ferguson, which are names that a lot of viewers know about, have learned in school, but they really stood for racial bias, racial segregation, lack of equal rights. Those were eventually overturned. So it's right, but the feeling, I just was talking to a person last week in Jacksonville who said to me, come on, Dean, you know that judges start with a result and work backward to get the conclusion that they want. And I don't believe that's the case, but it's very disturbing that people have lost confidence in the Supreme Court.
I want to ask you, I mean, public in general, has expressed skepticism about the Supreme Court. But, you were in a law school, and I've heard as well that some people, some teachers are finding it difficult to teach constitutional law these days because the way that it has traditionally been taught in terms of representing the Supreme Court as a legitimate institution of governance that cares about getting the law right, regardless of political background.
Our faculty members are doing an outstanding job of teaching constitutional law and the general universally applicable principles. But a world where the only constant is accelerating change is a marvelous intellectual and also practical challenge to deal with, and trying to determine how do we justifiably come up with rules that we all can agree and live by in our world. And that's the world we're living with. And it's not surprising that there's a lot of controversies.
If you're just joining us, I'm talking to the founding dean of Jacksonville University's Law School, Nick Allard. You can join our conversation. We're talking about the Supreme Court, its docket this season, and its current controversies to some extent. You can reach us at 904-549-2937, or you can email questions or comments to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also reach out and tag us on social. We're going to take a call from Eric in Arlington. Good morning, Eric. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I'm not sure that I buy your rationale that the reason for all these rulings and misdeeds by the Supreme Court is due to rapidly changing, technology and society. I mean, right is right and wrong is wrong. When you look at their rulings, if you put them all together, they support sort of a fascist viewpoint. Talking about their stance on antitrust, their support of strongman, Donald Trump in their recent ruling, the anti-democratic, sort of want to control women's bodies. That's sort of a traditional, kind of fascist viewpoint. And corporations are people too. They can, whereas with campaign finance, all these things, point directly to, a sort of fascist viewpoint. And the fact that they're taking money from billionaires all the time to go on trips and so on. This thing is broken. But thanks for taking my call.
Thanks, Eric. Your thoughts, Nick?
Well, Eric, I think that there was a lot packed in there in terms of conflict of interests and motivation and political bias and so on. And you've put your finger exactly on why people are very upset with the outcome of the court, because they don't believe that it's legitimate. The point I was making was slightly different, in that in terms of the applicability of precedents, we can expect a lot of changes in law in times when there is rapid changes. For example, with AI, which was something that's really breaking the borders. But your point of view is very consistent with what's been happening with the court.
So he mentioned things going back to campaign finance. I think a lot of people date, a belief that the court has become more partisan to the 2000 election, which essentially was decided by the Supreme Court on a party line vote. And I think a lot of people look to that as a time when maybe they had their thumb on the scale in a way that was political more than based in the law. I don't know what your thoughts are about how the 2000 election plays into the overall perception of the court.
Well, that decision was astonishing, and I was involved in the 2000 election at that time on the losing side. But it was very interesting that the court, in issuing that decision, said that it's not really precedent for anything. It's just the decision in this particular case, which was a signal to people. I think one of the reasons that people are very upset with the court right now is not just that longstanding precedents have been overturned, but that the feeling that, for example, Senator McConnell's delay in finding replacements for Scalia when he died, and so Merrick Garland was an outstanding judge, chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, and really very even-handed fellow. As you can tell from the way he's run the Justice Department, some people wish that he would be more decisive and less balanced and even-handed. And then again, after Justice Ginsburg passed away, holding off and denying an appointment or hearing on a successor for her until after the election when Trump won. So that, I think, is a pivotal moment in recent memory. I'm reminded every single day that things that happened in 2000, when I stand in front of a classroom or talk to students or young faculty, that's ancient history, that it's not a lived experience. So I think the more recent things, and then the consistent pattern of decisions, and this is then exacerbated by the very substantial disclosures about conflicts of interest and lack of ethical behavior. So it's a horrible bolus, which has this court, which was once the most revered part of our government, hemorrhaging its political and social capital, and it's a very serious problem. This court, for its decisions to stand, has to rely on people having confidence in the legitimacy of what it does, and it's getting to a red line or a danger point at this point.
I want to take a call from Mark on the South Side. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I was hoping your guest could comment about this. Regarding the Supreme Court ruling and Trump and immunity and all that, my understanding was that wasn't so much a judgment in favor of him as much as it was a confirmation of a previous Supreme Court case that came about around the time Nixon was president. And I guess a comment along those lines is if a president can't, for lack of a better word, enjoy immunity from the job, then you would always have a problem of one party going after a previous president for supposed malfeasance. For example, people said George Bush lied about weapons of mass destruction. If you didn't have immunity from your decisions, could they go back and have recourse against that? Could you go back against Joe Biden and the southern border and the influx of illegals and the federal government not controlling the border? Could you go back then and technically sue Biden for something a decision he made while in office? I personally am in favor of immunity because they don't have the presidents don't have the luxury of an armchair quarterback or hindsight and all that at the time, so they have to, be able to feel confident in the decisions that they make.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, Nick, there has been that point raised that this prevents, for instance, some presidents have been accused of being war criminals for their conduct in warfare. But this is also something that appears to make a president above the law. And it does seem like there was a time perhaps where retaliatory lawsuits against a former president would have been unimaginable. I mean, that almost is like a new reality to contend with.
Right, and the idea seems to have come from Mr. Trump because right now, during the present campaign, he has said that he plans to, if elected, prosecute his political opponents. So that's really very much on his mind. The principle involved in this case is the longstanding, grounded in U.S. law, that we don't have a king and no person is above the law, a king or a queen and no person is above the law. And a government cannot function if decisions of executive officers or elected officials are constantly challenged in court. That's absolutely true. But what there was the decision as I read it, the decision as I read it, is that there is immunity for the president in broad area of acting within his official duties, which I think was probably going to be the case anyway. But then there is immunity. There is no immunity when he acts outside the scope of his duties or her duties in an illegal or unofficial matter. Now, the problem is that there's great powers and there's constraints on the evidence that can be admitted in deciding where that line falls. But I have pretty complete confidence that when somebody is acting within the core of their presidential duties, like on foreign affairs or the Panama Canal, which is a very popular issue for people to challenge President Carter and others for. There was litigation brought there, but it was dismissed on the basis that it was squarely within their constitutional powers. So this recent decision has opened up a lot of uncertainty, which, in fact, like the Dobbs decision, like the affirmative action decision, does not resolve things. It expands the controversies.
We got an email from Ross, and he's responding to our caller earlier who said that the court's decisions, appear to support a fascist agenda. And Ross notes it was the Dobbs decision, that was overturning Roe versus Wade, that allowed Americans to once again vote on the issue of abortion. And he's saying, is that a fascist decision?
Well, I'm not going to apply the term fascist or get into that. I'm very reluctant to apply those terms for a lot of reasons. One is that it's not helpful in discourse and dealing with very difficult issues. It's tough enough. Second, I never want to marginalize how bad fascists and Nazis and other folks were. And so we'll just deal with things on the facts and on the merits of the arguments.
Kind of to his question, is making this a matter that individuals can vote on a more democratic solution to a problem, a controversy like abortion.
It's a fair point that voting on it, even returning it to the states where there are now votes and where a reversal of the Dobbs decision has happened, I think, in every state where it's been put on the ballot, and it's now on the ballot in Florida. That is democratic. Whether it's more or less democratic, remains to be seen. But no, it's certainly democratic for people to be able to vote. And they always have been able to vote in voting for the candidates. In voting for Trump to win, they clearly led, because he said he was going to do it and he did it, led to a more conservative court that was picked precisely because of what their position would be on the Roe v. Wade challenge.
And Democratic positions on something like segregation, clearly did reinforce those rules based on what the citizens were supporting at the time and the leaders that they were electing. So that also was a Democratic posture as opposed until the court adjusted it.
Well, this touches on a very subtle and important point, which is the success of our constitutional system of democracy is that it's a very cantilevered, self-correcting over time process. And there are democratic elements and there are undemocratic elements. The Senate is consciously less democratic than the House. It's been said it's the saucer that cools the coffee, the drink. And the Supreme Court is intentionally undemocratic. Once they're elected, lifetime tenure, which may be changed or may not be, they're undemocratic. So it's a combination of checks and balances that's built into our Constitution.
We've got a call from Eric in St. Johns County. Good morning, Eric. Go ahead.
Hi, how's it going? I listened to the preview for today's show yesterday, and I'm holding degrees in political science and international relations. My argument is that the ship has already sailed. I think that the judiciary is already in extremis and has been for some time, and I think we could take it back a few decades ago when they ruled that lobbyists have a First Amendment right, and so there's no check on the ability of people with the money to basically bribe Congress, which is what it is. They call it campaign contributions, but we all got common sense on this. The second one that really got me alarmed, and I was living up in New England at the time, was the Kelo decision, where it was misusing eminent domain for the benefit of private corporations to destroy people's homes. And by the way, that neighborhood in Connecticut never got developed because the recession happened. And lastly, all this stuff that's been going on with Scalia and Thomas with their unethical behavior and their unwillingness to acknowledge and impose some kind of ethical and moral standards on themselves, it just has me scared. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Eric. Nick.
Yeah, Eric, it has gone very far, and that's why there's very substantial proposals, including some significant legislation which Congress has the power to pass that, depending on the election outcome, might come to fruition to make some changes in not only the Supreme Court but the judiciary, increase the number of judges, not only to carry the workload. I will say that my experience with judges, having clerked with two very prominent judges, most of the federal judiciary, and certainly with the outstanding bench and bar of Northeast Florida, including the Fifth District Court of Appeals and the Duval County judges. They come from all parties. They are outstanding, and they're even-handed, and I'm very proud to say that they are role models for our students who get a real advantage in professionalism and ethics and service to the public and the rule of law. So I'm not, my mother, Mrs. Allard, did not bring up naive children, but I am not a skeptic or a cynic about the integrity of judges generally. The Supreme Court has engaged in some very troublesome behavior, and I think that's a fair point. And they're going to reap the whirlwind of the behavior of the last couple of years. That's my prediction.
I want to ask you about, we're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court,
Yes.
but what about the Florida Supreme Court, which has also been accused of being very political, very politicized, very much, a product of the governors that have appointed the members?
Well, first, I have to say I'm very grateful for the engagement and support and the example that the Florida Supreme Court has given to our students as we've grown. And one of the first visitors we had to spend time was Chief Justice Munoz, and my wife and I were at swearing in of some new members of the Supreme Court. Elections matter, results matter. I think that this court in Florida, even though I may have disagreed with some of the outcomes, is running by the book and is something that people can be proud of.
We've got an email from Judy. She says, I can't accept that election campaign-related actions of a sitting president as, quote, official duties of the office.
I think you're right, and I think that's the way it's likely to come out. And when you're engaged that's certainly the argument of this is my personal opinion, I have to say, and this is where I venture out into, dangerous territory as the dean of a law school that represents all people and prepares people for work as lawyers. But I think that's the nub of the case, and that if you're acting as a candidate or trying to engineer a particular election result, that is not within the official duties. You can't find it in the Constitution. I think that's the nub of the argument, is that election interference and insurrection and so on is not within the official duties of the sitting president. But the court will have to, the Constitution says what the Supreme Court says it does, so we'll have to see.
We're talking with JU Dean, Law School Dean Nick Allard this morning about the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, their docket ahead. We have a call from Susan in Mandarin. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for taking my call. My question is about our November ballot. We're going to be able to, which I wish we could do this for the U.S. Supreme Court, but we will be able to kick out some of the Florida Supreme Court justices. Two of them that are on our ballot actually wanted to prevent us from voting on Amendment 4. So I'm a big no on those two. And some people I've heard are saying they're going to vote no on any judge that DeSantis or Scott appointed, but that seems a little extreme to me because some of those people might actually be honorable and making good decisions. So I was wondering if you'd comment on the two Florida Supreme Court justices that are going to be on our November ballot and also the other ones. Thank you.
Well, those Florida provisions which allow, in effect, recalls of Florida justices are a bit unusual, but they are a way to democratize the process. I do note that, and I believe I'm comfortable in saying, comfortably accurate in saying this, that it's very rare for those kind of ballot initiatives to succeed. So, yeah, they're put to the test.
And what happens? It's basically a retention vote, right? Do you support retaining this justice? Yeah. And if they're not retained, what would happen? Their seat would be vacated and they'd be replaced by the governor.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. We have a call from Peter on the South Side. Good morning, Peter. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'm not sure if this has been addressed or not, but the whole issue of the election of judges seems to be something uniquely American. And I'm not quite sure whether that's good or bad, to be quite honest, especially as nowadays some judges seem to be alluding to their political leanings indirectly.
Well, it is unusual, and it's a topic that has, over decades and generations, received a lot of controversy and debate. On one hand, it's democratic. On the other hand, you run into the problem of campaign finance for judges. Should people who are running for judicial office be fundraising, and what the rules will be? So it's a very tricky wicket. So on one hand, it democratizes judicial selection, takes it out of the back room. On the other hand, it opens up the process to politics, just as you noted. So I'm not going to share with you my personal view on it, but I do have one.
All right. Thank you for that. So let's talk about some of the cases on the docket. One of the big ones that is, we already heard some arguments on, were the question of ghost guns. There's another gun case as to whether
Mexico.
Yeah, whether U.S. gun manufacturers can be held liable for the influx of, guns into Mexico, which has very strict anti-gun laws, but has a huge amount of guns from the U.S. And they're saying that the U.S. gun manufacturers are liable for their, incredible violence.
Right. And so that'll be very interesting. That not only touches sort of global, international issues relating to whether you can sue parties in the United States or sue Americans. Can a foreign country take advantage of a federal statute? But it also, underlying that, is a larger issue, which is the immunity that gun manufacturers receive with respect to harms caused by guns that they make. And that's really going to the nub of the issue. And the one reason the gun industry may be opposing it so vigorously is slippery slope, is that, right now we want to defend that immunity, and we don't want to have any diminution of the immunity. So it's a hot button issue, and it's an example that this is not going. It's one of many examples that this is not going to be a sleepy term.
Is that a unique to the gun manufacturers, that kind of, we think of product liability cases applying to most products? Is that unique in being a law that specifically protects the gun manufacturing industry?
Well, there have been others, but they've been peeled away over the years.
Okay. We've got a call from Jerry in St. Augustine. Good morning, Jerry. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. And thank you for this distraction. It's appreciated. My question is, have there ever been limits on how many Supreme Court justices one president can appoint? I'm thinking about the 3 that Donald Trump appointed. And could you foresee that would be a change? And if that would be a change, how would that procedure work?
That is a fantastic question. Full marks for you. If you're on the faculty, you get an A+ for developing a really great midterm or final exam question. So there's no limit on the number of justices that a president can. Most of them don't get too many choices because of lifetime tenure, and our justices have generally been pretty healthy for some reason. President Carter didn't get any, for example, and Trump got 3. That had a huge impact. What you should know is that there's some things that would require a constitutional amendment. So, for example, unless there's an impeachment of a judge, which happens rarely, but it happens, removing a sitting justice who has lifetime tenure would probably require a constitutional amendment. But there's major proposals to get at just what you're talking about. One of them was introduced by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, and it's very, very comprehensive. So, for example, and this touches your question, I think, exactly, is to increase the number of justices from 9 to 15, but to do it over a period of 12 years. Each 4 years, the sitting president gets to pick a new justice in the first and the third year. So this guarantees that there'll be at least 2, but possibly 3 presidents who get to make the decision. And the idea is to reduce the ability to pack the court from one political party or the other. Now, there's several other elements, reform elements of that bill, but that's the one I think that is most related to what you're talking about.
There have been other proposed reforms, particularly in light of some activism on the part of a couple of the justices' spouses. We saw Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, involved in the January 6th incident in terms of supporting denying the election and being very vocal about that in text that she was sending to Trump aides. on that day. And then more recently, Samuel Alito's wife flying a couple of flags that were controversial. One known as the Appeal to Heaven flag, that is kind of a symbol of, in some cases, kind of national Christian nationalism, and then also flying upside down the U.S. flag outside their home in Virginia. So the push would be to have, required recusals, for instance, if they're sitting on a case that involves January 6th. They have no obligation to do that.
Well, this goes to the heart of conflict of interest. So the reason that for rules, enforceable ethics rules, would be in part to deal with conflicts. So when somebody is behaving in a certain manner, or taking gifts, lavish gifts or trips from outsiders who may or may not have issues before the court, the issue is whether they should recuse themselves, whether they have a conflict of interest, whether there's been an ethical violation. Right now, it's up to the justices themselves, and it's unchallengeable whether they recuse themselves. Lawyers and judges in every other court have to very seriously think about avoiding not even a conflict, but the appearance of impropriety, the appearance of a conflict. And so one would think that you would seriously consider if a close family member, and there's none closer than your spouse, who is taking a position on a case that is before the court, that it would be very tough not to take or recuse yourself. Right now, there's no requirement. The justice just decides whether they can be objective or not, and there's no challenge to that. Arguably, I think that there could be more cases where they would, without any admission that they have a conflict, for appearance's sake, recuse themselves. The matter of the ethics laws, every other judge, every lawyer in the country is subject to enforceable ethics rules. This court is not. So you opened by saying this is was once called the least dangerous branch, but now it might be called the least accountable branch.
We have a call from Felix on the north side. Good morning, Felix. Go ahead.
Good morning. How you guys doing today?
Terrific.
Fine.
Yes, my question is, I was wondering, why doesn't the citizen get to vote for those 9 chief judges? Shouldn't it be on the ballot, and we have the House or the president to appoint these individuals?
It's a good question. I mean, constitutionally, that's not how we do it, but I mean,
That's an interesting question. So I guess the best answer we can give you without a constitutional amendment is that voters get to vote for the president. Your vote matters, and so what to expect in terms of the president making the Supreme Court selections should be on people's minds when they vote. Now, interestingly, as somebody who's been involved in presidential politics and campaigns for over 3 decades, one of the things that always surprised me was, and this may be a different election, but the Supreme Court and who those justices are and the ability of the president to nominate a Supreme Court justice often is way down on the list of priorities on people's minds. Usually the economy is at the top, and, judicial selections, they're important to some people, but in terms of the general population, they're way down on the list.
Another case that is going to be on the docket this year is care for transgender minors. That's a Tennessee case that basically current law bans hormone treatments for transgender minors. Do you have any sense how that will play out in this court, in this current composition?
Well, there's generally court cases percolating and finding their way up that are challenging restrictions, state restrictions, and the one you mentioned is one of them, on transgender treatments and also programs, gender-affirming programs. This one, I think, may well be decided not on the substance, but on a procedural issue.
Like standing or?
Well, whether the challenge is properly brought, to this court after the ruling has been made, and whether the parties are the correct parties and all of that.
You say that because of the case itself, or just because you think the court won't want to involve itself?
Well, they may be able to decide. There is a doctrine that the court should avoid constitutional decisions when it can, and decided on a non-constitutional issue, and this may well be one that they can do it on. I'm a little fuzzy on the details. I'm admitting this. I hope none of my students are listening to this.
That's all right. You are a wealth of information. It's a good conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time away from school to come and talk to us about it. Nick Allard, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ann. Anytime. It's a pleasure.
Up next, how to inspire a new generation to embrace classical music. Welcome back. Inspiring the next generation of musicians is the focus of the Jacksonville Symphony's Artist in Residence program. And here to tell us about it is Jacksonville Symphony Music Director Courtney Lewis. Good morning, Courtney.
Good morning. Great to see you again.
It's great to have you. So tell me, how does one get chosen as an artist in residence?
Well, we think about what kind of artist has had a special relationship with our audience in the past, who has particularly excited people, who has brought a special chemistry to the relationship between the audience and the orchestra, who does the orchestra like working with, whose programming and repertoire suits what we're trying to achieve. And in all these ways, the person that we chose for this season, the American pianist Conrad Tao, just fits the bill perfectly.
Conrad has been on this program previously. He is kind of an extraordinary, was a child prodigy, has gone on to win all kinds of accolades. But tell me a little bit about that chemistry, because the last time he was here, he was performing with the symphony.
Last time was in January, and he did Rhapsody in Blue for the 100th anniversary of the composition of the piece, and Rachmaninoff's Fourth Piano Concerto. And we also took it on tour to Daytona Beach and West Palm, and it got amazing reviews and great reception. Before that, he'd done Prokofiev 3 with me and Mozart C Minor Concerto. He actually had a relationship with the Jacksonville Symphony from when he was 12, from long before I was music director. So musicians remember him as a little boy coming here and performing years ago. And
that's so cute.
He's always sold tickets amazingly well, got on with our donors really well. This season, we're particularly excited because he's coming twice to perform concerts, and the second performance will be the world premiere of his own original piano concerto next April.
And so he does compose. He's known for these amazing performances of existing pieces, and he really has this amazing range.
He does. He's an extremely versatile artist. He's also a fascinating individual. He's really intelligent, and I love performing with him because I very rarely disagree with his musical interpretation. You know, so often when you meet a performer and they're playing the piece and you're conducting and you don't agree about everything, it can be quite a sort of testy relationship. But with Conrad, we always seem to have the same ideas, and we love talking about the music before we perform it together.
And what does that look like when you disagree with interpretation? I mean, those of us who are not musicians at heart may not even understand what that means.
Well, what speed are you going to go at? Where does the phrase go? Usually depends who's more famous or who's older, which way you go.
But I mean, you're the music director.
I know.
If they're your guest, I mean, right? You kind of get to make that call.
No, my job is to accompany the soloist. If I've hired them, I've given them that license.
I gotcha. And so Conrad, is he in town for this artist in residency program, or is he just kind of coming back and forth?
He comes back and forth. He's very busy with his other engagements all around the world.
I mean, he does perform all over the world.
He does, yep.
So we're going to take a quick break and come back on the other side. I want to ask you more about Conrad and also maybe hear a little bit of a piece that he did that is a big departure. So we're talking.
Teach is a day-long conference created to engage, empower, and inspire teachers.
I have been so inspired by all the teachers and future teachers that we have at this conference, the Teach Conference in Jacksonville, and it has been a positive day that has just really re-inspired me and got me really excited to go back into the classroom.
For tickets and more info, go to wjct.org/teach.
Media sane-washing Donald Trump. Using sound bites and sensible summaries, are we making the former president sound more coherent than he actually is?
He goes on these rants, he goes on these digressions. They're often extremist, they're often out and out racist, they're often violent. If you skip over those as chaff rather than wheat, you're just not communicating to your readers what happened.
That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Do we have a military ready to fight the wars of the future? Admiral James Stavridis says warfare is shape-shifting in front of our eyes, signaling a growing need for what he calls elite, highly trained humans.
So that can be a SEAL, it can be a Marine Raider, it can be an artificial intelligence engineer, those kind of special forces.
Author and NATO's former Supreme Allied Commander tells us more next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
And we're back. If you're just joining us, I've been talking to Jacksonville Symphony music director Courtney Lewis about the Artist in Residency program that the Symphony does and its focus on mentoring young adults. So this year you chose Conrad Tao, as we discussed. Last year he performed, or earlier this year in January, he performed Rhapsody in Blue and Rachmaninoff's Fourth. What is he going to be performing with you and for you?
Well, two main programs are coming up. Next 2 weeks from now, he's performing the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini, Rachmaninoff's last concerto, penultimate concerto. And then later in the season, he's also coming back to offer the world premiere of his own original piano concerto in April, which we're particularly excited about.
And what is that called and how does it sound like? What's his style?
Well, he's a very eclectic composer. He's been commissioned by the New York Philharmonic, by lots of big orchestras, but I haven't seen the score yet, so I can't tell you what it's like. I'm waiting for it to arrive in the post any day, so fingers crossed it'll arrive soon.
And so you commission a work from him, basically?
Yes.
For the symphony. And what kind of instructions do you give him?
Well, he was lucky because it's on the same program as The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, the great ballet from 1913 that ushered in modernism. And that means that he has a huge orchestra at his disposal. So 4 woodwinds, 8 horns, loads of percussion. So he's got a lot of color to splash about in. Usually we would say double winds for commission so that we don't have to hire extra people. But since we're already all on stage for that program, he's able to make use of a really big group of people.
And so other than that, what kind of parameters are there? Is it like a time frame that you give him? Is there a style that you're going for?
Yeah, you will usually say a instrumentation and time frame. So I can't remember if we said 20 or 30 minutes, but something around that. A substantial piece of music. That will be preceded by the Debussy Nocturnes, one of his earliest pieces, and then finished with, as I said, Stravinsky's Le Sacre de Printemps, The Rite of Spring from 1913, one of my favorite pieces of music. Other than that, you trust the artist. I listen to a lot of his music. The thing is, Conrad is so eclectic that you can't really tell what you're going to get because so many of his pieces are so different from each other. So we'll just have to wait and see. That's part of the excitement, of course.
So you say he's eclectic, and I was looking at some of his write-ups, by various publications. He's been really highly praised by publications like NPR and New York Times. I mean, he really is kind of a championed, performer. But he does this varied album that he created called American Rage, which kind of looks at everything from like the social justice movements of the 30s all the way to the present, really. And he does this one piece about 9/11. It's actually a composition written by Julia Wolf, but I just wanted to play a minute of it because it's very discordant and strange, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. So that piece is actually called Compassion, which I think is an interesting name for a piece that is as challenging as that is to listen to. How does that piece strike you? It's obviously not the kind of stuff that he has performed here or will be performing here.
No. Well, I mean, you had those dissonant chords, the splashy bits, but then in between when you just had those alternating fifths, it was actually not so discordant. I mean, that sounded like it could be quite relaxing or consoling in some ways. But I haven't heard the whole piece, so I don't know. What I would say is that he often plays weird pieces for encores. Every time he's come here, he's played some completely wacky thing that I've always thought would turn the audience completely off. And in fact, the opposite has happened. That's what's so magic about Conrad. He has this special way of presenting whatever he plays in a way that's so compelling that people actually come a lot further than you would think they would in their acceptance of what he's playing. And that's kind of why I wanted him to compose a piece for us, because I've realized in Jacksonville that if I try to play a modern piece from, let's say, 1940, quite often the audience is turned off and doesn't know how to approach it, doesn't know how to listen to it. But if I ask a composer to write a piece for us, and the composer is there, and the audience feels part of the creation and discovery of this piece, then the reaction is entirely different. And that's one of the reasons why we've pivoted from playing lots of modern music to commissioning new music, so that the audience feels part of that creation process.
Oh, what an interesting
And
strategy.
I don't doubt that Conrad will be able to convince us of whatever he plays.
And so he's still a very young man. I mean, he was a child prodigy, and I don't know exactly how old he is right now, but
29, I think.
29. So what is it about having somebody youthful in this artist in residence program in terms of trying to capture a new audience or get people who might not be traditional listeners to symphonic music?
Well, I think we've got to remember that representation is incredibly important in classical music. So if somebody wants to be involved in something, they need to see people like them on stage. This happens when we're trying to get more diverse cultures of people in all sorts of ways. If people see different races of people on stage, if they recognize themselves, they're more inclined to come to the concert. If people see a younger guy with a crazy haircut wearing a t-shirt and a black pair of pants and not wearing a tuxedo, who's pouring out energy and enthusiasm, they're more likely to think, okay, that relates to me. And I've seen that 1,000 times. So he brings a very special energy, a very attractive energy to younger people, but he also brings a great deal of energy to older people as well. Some of our most conservative donors absolutely love him because they just feel this incredible freshness and life that comes through his performances and interpretations.
I mean, he's a delightful guy. Courtney Lewis, thank you so much for being here today. It was a great conversation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And that's our program. Thank you so much for listening. If you have feedback or suggestions, we encourage you to send either. You can send them to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. And if you missed anything, you can catch our rebroadcast tonight at 8 o'clock, or you can find our entire archive on your favorite podcast platform. Join us tomorrow when we ask the president of the AMA about the reimbursement battles fueling local standoffs between health providers and insurance companies. I'm Ann Schindler.
Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. Life South Community Blood Centers, providing blood and patient services to the local hospitals, serving patients in this community. Donating blood with Life South helps save lives. More at lifesouth.org to find a blood drive near you.
After a roller coaster summer, the ballots are set, and the countdown to November has begun. Stay with NPR News to get closer to the issues and closer to your vote.